President Biden is getting ready to head to Michigan for his second domestic trip as president. He'll be visiting the Pfizer facility where we first saw COVID vaccines shipped out 2 months ago. But first, he will be part of the G7 virtual meeting this hour, and he'll be speaking at the virtual Munich Security Conference later this morning. Let's go right to NBC's chief White House correspondent, my friend Kristen Welker at the White House. Kristen, President Biden is under an enormous amount of pressure to get something done on COVID relief. And let's be honest, the clock is ticking down to March 14th. What's his goal for today's trip?
Well, his goal, Steph, is exactly that, to make his public pitch for his $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. He's going to be touring that plant in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and, of course, touting the fact that he is promising as many as 600 million vaccine doses by the end of July. So that's his target for when the vast majority of Americans, he says, will be able to get vaccinated. But he's going to make the case, Steph, that in order to do it, he needs funds from Congress, that is a critical piece of this equation. So expect that to be part of what you hear today. And of course, it comes amid some pushback from Democrats and Republicans who say that the overall price tag, that $1.9 trillion, is just too steep. It's just too high. But the administration's response to that is, look, we have put the pieces together and this is what is needed, not just to deal with the COVID crisis, but also to deal with the economic crisis. So that's one piece of messaging that we're going to hear from President Biden today. Steph, you also mentioned the fact that the president is going to be speaking virtually at those two international summits. His message will be that it is a global responsibility to fight COVID. In fact, he's going to be announcing a new donation to the COVAX fund. And he's going to be talking about the fact that under his leadership, the United States is going to strengthen and re-engage with its traditional allies. Of course, during former President Trump, there was an America First foreign policy. So he's turning the page on that, Steph, and it comes against the backdrop of this news that the administration has announced it is open to sitting down and resuming talks with Iran and other partner countries to potentially talk about resuming the Iran nuclear deal, Steph.
It is a busy day ahead. Kristen Welker, thank you. We're going to leave it there. Coming up next, the CEO of Robinhood saying he's sorry for what happened with the GameStop frenzy. But is an apology all we're going to get? Plus, more of my interview with Senator Elizabeth Warren, why she thinks distrust in the market caused by what we saw with GameStop is bad for the overall economy. This morning, a whole lot of questions still remain after lawmakers spent more than 5 hours grilling Wall Street and tech CEOs about the rise and fall of GameStop and other stocks last month that were amid a volatility frenzy. Most of the questions and the fury was aimed at Robinhood CEO Vlad Tenev, who came under fire after his mobile trading app halted some trading as stocks surged, costing some users millions.
Despite the unprecedented market conditions in January, at the end of the day, what happened is unacceptable to us. To our customers, I'm sorry and I apologize. Please know that we are doing everything we can to make sure this won't happen again.
Now, thousands of those customers are suing Robinhood, including Kevin Kelly, a high school football coach from Little Rock, Arkansas.
And we're at the 10-yard line about to score a touchdown. We have passed everybody else. Nobody's going to stop us. It's over with. And we were about to sell and make our money that next day. And they wouldn't let us. It's like the refs blew the whistle. And we're at the 10 going, we're about to score. There's nobody in our way. Everybody else is way back there. And we're about to score. So, yeah, they did change the rules just like in a football game.
But lawmakers say it's about more than one crazy week on Wall Street. It's about protecting investors and actually the entire economy.
It's important to everyone because the overall functioning of the economy is good for all of us. It's how people get jobs. It's how salaries go up. It's how we have goods and services that we're able to buy. The stock market may seem like something that's far and distant, but in fact, it touches people's lives every day in multiple ways. A good functioning stock market is good for the American economy.
Joining us now to discuss, Scott Galloway, professor at NYU Stern School of Business and, of course, co-host of the Pivot podcast, and Alexis Goldstein, senior policy analyst for Americans for Financial Reform. Scott, to you first. We're used to seeing these hearings with all sorts of fireworks. CEOs in the hot seat, Mark Zuckerberg sweating with 1,000 cameras in his face. The fact that this whole thing, unfortunately, was awkwardly on Zoom, did it kind of miss its moment to get something done?
Well, yeah, I think we all miss those moments of electricity and sort of those unscripted moments. And seeing someone on Zoom in 2 dimensions just naturally reduces the power. But there were still some powerful moments. I think the key takeaway was that there wasn't a conspiracy against traders in that week. There's a larger conspiracy, and that is on Robinhood. When your business model is payment for order flow, your primary objective is to get people to trade more and take more and more risk. And the statistics are pretty straightforward. 80% of day traders lose money. 80% of options expire worthless. 80%, or the people on traders on Robinhood on a size adjusted basis trade 80 times the number of options as other trading platforms. So when you detach from the most powerful source in the universe, and that is time, and you're at a poker table with other people and it's a zero-sum game, and a couple of those poker players have supercomputers and statisticians and more chips to survive bad hands, you're just naturally at a disadvantage. So the good news, there wasn't a conspiracy last week. The bad news is the conspiracy is much broader than that.
Okay, but then, Alexis, here's the bad news. For many of those individual traders who are suing Robinhood, they're not suing to be protected. They're suing for more access and more ability to take risk, the opposite of what Scott's talking about.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with Scott. I don't think that there was malice on Robinhood's part, but I also agree with Representative Ocasio-Cortez, who asked, was there incompetence on the part of Robinhood? Was the reason that they froze the trades in late January because they just didn't have their internal risks in order at their company? And this, let's not forget that Robinhood had a series of outages over the summer. They've had problems with their user interface. It's not the first time they've gotten into trouble. And I think Mr. Tenev failed to explain what really happened at the end of January. And I think he also threw out some bogus numbers. He threw out this $35 billion of both realized and unrealized profit, which you don't get to take unrealized profits to the bank. And he didn't disclose how many assets under management Robinhood has, which makes that a meaningless number. So I think there remain a ton of open questions about whether Robinhood really has a handle on their own business. And I think that's part of what happened with this lawsuit. And I think a lot of people suffered as a result.
Scott, what's amazing that we've seen over the last year, many people that in other scenarios wouldn't be trading, wouldn't be investing because they don't have disposable income, were doing so in part out of desperation. Yesterday, while all of this was going on, we actually heard from Walmart CEO Doug McMillon about raising wages for his employees. Watch this.
We do think the federal minimum wage should go up. $7.25 is too low. It's been too long since it's been adjusted. So some form of an adjustment there, and hopefully indexing it to something so that over time, businesses large and small have some certainty around what the federal minimum wage is going to be. As you know, around the country, states have started to move. We've moved. Our starting wage rate is up 50% since 2015.
Do these two things tie together in any way? And possibly if people are making more of a living wage, they won't be in desperate gambling situations?
100%, Stephanie. As Alexis pointed out in her powerful article this morning in the New York Times, lottery ticket sales go up in times of incredible income inequality. The underlying incendiary, I believe, to all of this are very scary statistics. For the first time in our nation's history, a young man or woman at the age of 30 isn't doing as well as their parents were at 30. That involves shame. That involves rage. You've had billionaires increase their wealth from 1.9 trillion to 4 trillion in 10 years. Meanwhile, the federal minimum wage has exploded from 725 to 725. This stimulus has done, 4 in 5 people who've received this stimulus say they're not going to spend it, so it goes into the market. Exploding stock prices. Who owns 90% of stocks and real estate by gross dollar volume? The rich. Everything we have done in terms of our tax policy, in terms of our legislative policy, has one aim, and that is to transfer wealth from people under the age of 40 who tend to be less white, who tend to be asset holders, tend to be less male, to transfer it to an older generation that tends to be more male in terms of asset ownership and more white. Their rage is absolutely warranted.
Yeah, they don't have the opportunity to pursue the American dream, and they deserve it. Scott, Alexis, thank you so much. And I recommend Alexis's piece out today in the New York Times. Much of the lower 48 states is waking up this morning, still dealing with this nasty winter freeze. But just as it hit all of us this week, Texas still seems to be getting it the worst. This morning, it is just as cold in Houston as it is here in Manhattan. The good news is that the Texas power outages that were in the millions are now just down to a few 100,000. The bad news, no power has been replaced with a different kind of nightmare, no water. Millions of people have had their water supply disrupted thanks to burst pipes and frozen wells. The director of Austin's water supply said yesterday tens of thousands of people had no water at all, and that is happening all across the state. And if that wasn't bad enough, gas stations now running out of gas, grocery stores are out of food, and people are afraid to go out and get help because of the pandemic. On Thursday, President Biden declared a state of emergency in Texas and Oklahoma. He decided to send generators and other supplies. That's going to take time, and time is not on their side. I want to bring in Antonia Hilton. She's in Jersey Village, a small city attached to northern Houston. Antonia, you were speaking 2 days ago to a mother who had been driving around because her children needed their medicine at a certain temperature. That same mother now faces gas shortages. You're also talking to people who are without water. What's it like for them?
Stephanie, the challenges of this week are starting to have a cumulative effect on people, particularly families that are low income. The lights, the power, the heat is starting to come back on for most people in the city of Houston and in Harris County, but that's being replaced by a water crisis. People don't have safe water to drink, or they don't have any water at all in many cases. I've spoken to more families who have been driving around, going to grocery stores and gas stations, trying to find someone who can sell them drinkable water. I met with a family yesterday that took somebody's pool water so that they could boil it and allow their children to bathe in the water and to wash some of their clothes because they hadn't done that properly since last weekend. I then spent the evening at an affordable housing complex where I met residents who say they have no water at all. I only met one person in this large complex who said they had some cold water coming through. I want you to hear a little bit of the story of Cheryl Walker. She works at a local hospital and lived in that housing complex, and her husband right now is suffering with kidney failure. Take a listen to what they've been dealing with. What's this like for your husband who's on dialysis, to be in these conditions?
I'm scared right now for my husband. I really am. God knows I'm scared for him because he's really congested, really bad. I say, honey, you okay? You okay? I'll just be asking, you okay? You okay? He say, yeah, baby, I'm okay. I say, no, you don't sound okay, Charles. You don't sound okay. And you showed he ain't looking okay to me either.
You can hear the pain in Cheryl's voice right there. And, you know, you have to keep in mind right now, Stephanie, these same communities like the neighborhood right there, they have been hit the hardest by COVID over the past year. And now in the midst of this crisis, they have the fewest resources, the fewest options. They don't have another home they can go to or places where they've been able to warm up. And now they can't even cook food with their water or clean their clothes. It's been a horrible week for Texans here, Stephanie.
It's been a horrible year. Antonia, thank you so much for reporting these important stories. I mean, there is no doubt Texans are in a desperate situation. Many are going to dangerous lengths, actually, to get themselves clean water and to keep themselves warm. I want to stay on this and bring in Dr. Samuel Prater. He's an emergency room physician with UT Health out of Houston, Texas. Doctor, we know you've been seeing an increasing number of injuries, specifically carbon monoxide poisoning linked to this crisis. Tell us about it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Started on Monday night. You know, I think folks had been without power for over 24 hours at that point, frigid temperatures. And so very desperate times and resorted to desperate measures to try to warm themselves and to warm their families and their children. And so those who had access to a generator, to warm space heaters, had the generators in improper locations. So inside an attached garage or outside right next to a window. But mostly what we saw is folks bringing in charcoal grills, barbecue pits, campfire stoves, or even their stovetop, and using that to burn whatever they could to try to generate heat, and then inadvertently poison their entire family.
My gosh. How about those who need power for all of their regular medications, people who are on dialysis, people who need nebulizers? What do they do in a situation like this?
Yeah, it was really, it's really a desperate situation and a sad situation. And this is, in no uncertain terms, a public health disaster in our local area. Hospitals were already full when the freeze hit, and we then had no ability to discharge some of these frail patients who do require these sorts of things at home, like power to power a nebulizer machine, or if they need power to power a home ventilator. So we couldn't discharge them. So the hospitals were already full. And then as the carbon monoxide poisonings hit, then we started seeing folks who've been without power for too long coming in because, again, they can't power their home nebulizer machines, home ventilators, right? And even worse, right? All the dialysis centers were without power and they had no water. And so over the last, I would say, 48 to 72 hours, we've been seeing a significant increase in the number of patients with complications related to no dialysis for the last week.
When you talk about this disaster, you've been facing this disaster or a different one for over a year dealing with the pandemic. How does COVID play a role in all of this and the hospital's ability to treat people?
It certainly does, just because the hospitals were already full from the recent spike after the holiday period. So hospitals were already full. We were already stressed and challenged. And then you compound that with the inability to discharge patients to frigid homes and homes with no power. And then add on that the increase in spike in volume from carbon monoxide poisonings, from mechanical injuries from slipping on ice, and then all the medical necessities that patients can't get when they don't have power in their homes. It really has taxed the healthcare system in Houston like nothing that I've ever seen in the last 10 years.
You're an emergency room doctor. You have seen a lot. Do you think that the death count at the end of this could be higher than we've seen so far, with so many people in their homes unaccounted for at this point?
Definitely. I think that's one of the things that the healthcare community at large is worried about is this weekend, how many patients are we going to find who died in their homes from accidental hypothermia, or who died from carbon monoxide poisoning, or who died because they just didn't have access to power for dialysis, for home ventilator use, for nebulizer machines, and all that stuff. So that's what we're worried about seeing this weekend.
Well, doctor, thank you for all that you're doing. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now let's bring in the mayor of Houston, Texas, Sylvester Turner. Mayor, tell us about the situation in your city. We understand most of the power has been restored, but not the water.
Let me just say this has been a tough week for people across the state of Texas, and certainly even in the Houston region, where we started off with about 1.4 million people, customers without power. Now that number is under 10,000. But for that 10,000, it's still very real for them and very tough for them. So I don't want to minimize that. At the same time, there's been a cascading effect. You lose power. It impacts the water pressure. I will say that when the water pressure falls under what we call 20 PSI, that's the regulatory requirement for it to be above, you are required to give a boil water notice. So that took place, for example, on Wednesday. As of yesterday, on Thursday, we were able to push that pressure above 20. It averaged yesterday at about 29. And today, that pressure is now above 30, and we are continuing to push it. So there are a lot more people who have water. We're still trying to push it even higher, but there are still some, especially, for example, if you live in apartments and you're on the second, third, fourth floor or higher. It's going to be tough, but today it should get increasingly better. So we've made some improvement, but we still, have a way to go.
You've got at least 2 more days of freezing temperatures. What's your biggest worry going forward?
Well, my biggest worry is that for example, as power is being restored, but water, the pipes are bursting. And I'm especially concerned for people in our low-income communities, for our seniors who don't have the means, for example, to go to a hotel. They don't have fireplaces, for example. They don't have the means to get a plumber out there as quickly as possible. So I'm really concerned with those individuals, people who are already on the margins and they've been pushed further down. I'm concerned about those individuals who don't have insurance, don't have the financial means. And so I have put in place the steps to create a fund for those individuals who fall in those categories, because we want them to know that even after their power is restored, where they haven't suffered damages in their homes, we want to do everything we can to assist them.
Is the state and the governor's office helping you do this?
No, this is separate in part from the state and the governor's office. In fact, I have not talked to the governor at any time during this crisis.
You're the mayor of Houston. The governor of your state hasn't reached out to you since this began?
I have not talked to the governor, but we are pushing forward. We recognize that there are a lot of people who are suffering. And just bear in mind, for those who have means, yes, they're inconvenienced and they're impacted. But for those who don't have means, for those who are on the lower level of our social economic strata, they are the ones who are being devastated by these conditions and the fact that the state did not produce enough generation to prevent a lot of these blackouts. Having said all of that, I am so proud of Houstonians and people in our region who come together, who lend support, who open up their stores like Jim McAvell Gallery Furniture, open up their churches, faith-based institutions, other businesses, and people who are just giving, like people who have stepped up and are giving to this fund. So we will come together and we'll get past it. But it has been a tough week, and I don't want to understate that. And especially for people who have been suffering through the coronavirus, people who have lost their jobs, people who have been struggling to take care of their families. And then all of a sudden, here they come, power outages. They're losing everything in their refrigerators. Their ceilings are falling. They don't know where to go. They don't have fireplaces. They can't go to a hotel. They're sleeping in their cars. They're dying because of carbon monoxide poisoning, the hypothermia. There was a senior citizen the other day that was found in our home dead, and the cause was hypothermia. People are just trying to find ways to stay warm. And so this is the opportunity, the time for us to rally, to be supportive of one another. And we're gonna stay with it until we come through this crisis. But recognizing that even after we come through this crisis, for many people, for many families without means, this crisis will continue long past water pressure being restored and the lights being turned on.
Then it's an opportunity to better for them. I do want to ask you about one specific Texan who is trying to stay warm going on vacation to Mexico, Ted Cruz. The Houston Chronicle reports that police officers from your city provided security for him when he left the country on Wednesday. Did that divert any resources from those suffering residents that you're talking about?
Well, you know, our resources are stretched very thin. You know, for our police officers, for example, ever since Sunday, all of them have been brought back in uniform to do everything they can to assist Houstonians. So they've been stressed thin. Our firefighters have been stressed thin. You know, look, let me just put it this way. Leaders lead, and when, as elected officials, we have a fiduciary relationship with the people who are in our cities or in our state, and when things are happening on the ship, we simply stay on the ship, and that's the commitment that we make when we sign up for these positions, and people expect us, if nothing else. They expect us to be there when they're suffering, when they're in pain, when they're trying to figure out what's my next step, how I'm going to take care of my families, my kids. At the very least, our obligation is to be there and saying, I hear you, I see you, I'm standing with you. And until we can get additional resources, I'm going to be by your side. That's what we do, even if it comes at the expense of our own families. So we'll continue to move forward. But what I want the people in this city to know is that until every single person is in a better shape as a result of this winter storm, we're going to be right there with you. And we're not going to leave you behind, because most other folks' lights may have been restored and most other folks may have their water we're going to stay there because we recognize that for our most at-risk and vulnerable populations, this is not their first time being stretched thin or being pushed down. And at the very least, they need to know that they are not going to be abandoned in their moment of need.
Mayor, thank you so much for all that you do, and thank you for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me.
We are sending safe and warm wishes to our brothers and sisters in Houston. Still ahead, Pfizer just announcing it will start COVID vaccine trials on pregnant women. I'll be asking the former acting CDC director what he would tell expecting mothers who are questioning the safety of the vaccine. Plus, this morning, we are one step closer to knowing if it's safe for pregnant women to get the COVID vaccine. Pfizer just said it will start vaccination trials on pregnant women. It is the first time this is being done in the United States, and they're hoping to get 4,000 expecting mothers. This, as a new study found that the COVID infection rate is 70% higher in pregnant women, especially women of color. So not everyone is comfortable with getting this vaccine.
I just need more time for the data to mature.
I'm looking to those people who can actually understand the science and read through it, digest it, and really get to a point where they feel comfortable recommending it. That's when I think I would feel more comfortable taking it myself.
I want to bring in Dr. Richard Besser. He's the president and CEO of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, also the former acting CDC director. Dr. Besser, do you feel comfortable recommending the vaccine to expecting mothers?
You know, Stephanie, this is one of those challenging questions, and it's one where a pregnant person needs to talk to their doctor. What I would be asking if it were one of my relatives or one of my patients is, what is your risk of exposure? Do you work in an area where there's a high chance or significant chance that you could get infected with COVID? If so, I would recommend it. And the reason for that is that we know that pregnancy is a risk factor for more severe COVID infection, greater likelihood of having a severe illness that could land you in the hospital. You know, one of the challenges of the way we develop vaccines and medications is that in the first round of trials, women who are pregnant are excluded. And that's done out of an abundance of caution. Because early on, the question of could there be harm weighs very heavily on those who are developing products. The challenge with that is that when you have a vaccine then that's approved or a medication that's approved is there's no information, there's no data on pregnant women. And so you have to balance those risks until those studies can be done. For someone who, go ahead, Stephanie.
If they're done and they prove successful, could this have a positive impact on reopening schools? Think about teachers, many of whom are young moms, women who plan on getting pregnant and weren't comfortable going back to school because they didn't want to get the vaccine.
Yeah, I think any information that allows people who are pregnant to make a more informed decision will be helpful. You know, when it comes to school reopening, thankfully, the science is showing that there are ways to reopen schools safely without vaccination. Vaccination will add another layer. And given that there are so many women of reproductive age who teach in the schools or who work in schools, having that information will be very, very helpful.
You and I have spoken a lot about healthcare equity. We're learning that pharmacies, Walgreens, CVS are partnering with rideshare companies to give people who don't have transportation a ride to get the vaccine. That's great. But isn't that a secondary issue? The primary issue, you've got all sorts of people without the technology to go online and get an appointment to begin with.
Yeah, you know, there's been such an obsession over the number of people being vaccinated each day, not enough attention into whose arms are these vaccines going into. Are they going into the arms of the communities that have been most affected? You know, Black, Latino, Native Americans who have been hospitalized and dying at rates that far surpass their proportion of the population. And so many being infected because they are essential workers, they're working. And if you're not setting up systems to ensure that you're meeting people's needs where they are, you know, if you're vaccinating 9 to 5, then people who are working aren't going to be able to get there. If you're vaccinating 9 to 5, people who don't have sick leave or medical leave won't be able to get there. So, you know, the community pharmacy approach is a good one. People are used to getting flu shots and other shots at their community pharmacies. These rideshare approaches are good. But one of the things that I want to see, and we're not seeing, is every single state reporting data by race, ethnicity, and neighborhood on vaccination. So you can see who's getting vaccinated and who's not. Where do you have to put additional resources? Without that kind of information, you're kind of going blindly into this.
I definitely want to see that info. Dr. Richard Besser, thank you for joining us. You always make us smarter when you're here.
Thanks, Stephanie.
And right now, we're going to dig into this. Texas Senator Ted Cruz facing major backlash this morning after he was caught escaping to Cancun as his state faces its worst crisis in decades. Many Texans going on 5 days without power or running water in freezing temperatures during a pandemic. The senator initially said he was just going to drop off his daughters, but then he changed his story. He admitted last night that he planned to stay through the weekend, and he changed his flight after he had second thoughts.
Well, look, in hindsight, if I'd understood how it would be perceived, the reaction people would have, obviously I wouldn't have done it. It was a mistake. At the same time, look, I mean, I got to admit, I started having second thoughts really as I sat down on the plane.
After he had second thoughts, after he was caught by the media. Joining us now to discuss someone who knows this state better than anyone, Jim Moore. He's been writing about and reporting Texas politics and culture for decades. Jim, your reaction to Ted Cruz's short-lived trip to Mexico, is this part of a bigger problem with Texas leadership?
It's certainly part of a problem with Ted Cruz, Stephanie. I think the misunderstanding most people have about this guy is that he did not make a mistake in judgment. He was simply being Ted Cruz. You heard him on that clip you just played. What he was concerned about was perception, not the morality, not the reality of the fact that he was abandoning his state as people are burning their furniture. They're standing out line in sub-freezing temperatures, waiting to get buckets of water to take home. There are people filling up their dinnerware and their Tupperware with snow to flush their toilets. And there are people literally dying here, and he's worried about the perception. The misunderstanding of Ted Cruz and what he is in Texas is that he didn't think about this at all. He didn't think about how can I help, what can I do for my state, can I facilitate things with FEMA, can I talk to people and help Washington better understand what is needed down here. Instead, he did what a lot of Mexicans do, which is to cross the border and travel 1,200 miles to find heat, light, and water for his family.
Then if this is just Ted Cruz being Ted Cruz, why does he keep getting elected? What does that tell you about Texans?
Well, it tells me something rather disturbing as a guy who's lived all his adult life here. I mean, we keep electing these people that give us problems like what we've just experienced. We have conservatives in Texas who simply think that not just less government is better, but almost no government. In fact, the governor today is complaining about ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which screwed up the entire grid when the storm hit. And he's talking about reforming it and fixing it. But he's culpable in this thing. He has known for years that the grid has not been hardened against catastrophic weather events. There were recommendations about 10 years ago that the grid and the generating plants be upgraded in a way that would protect them from huge weather events like storms and freezes of this nature. And they ignored it because we have our own grid. We are not susceptible to federal regulations because we contain it within inside of our borders. And if you spend millions of dollars to upgrade, you're cutting into profits. So it never happens. So it's wildly disingenuous of the governor and Ted Cruz and everybody else in the conservative movement in Texas to come back and say, oh, we're going to fix it. We're going to solve this problem. They knew it was there. They simply ignored it because it's profitable to ignore.
Then knowing Texas as well as you do, when we get past this, when the sun shines again, when things warm up and people are safe in their homes, hopefully, are Texans going to forget about this and just go right back to the way they were?
I think that's the big, important question, Stephanie. And what I'd like to believe is that this is a kind of seismic event that the COVID and the coronavirus have been for Donald Trump. I think that this may be the moment that has peeled back the covers on what conservatism is all about. In this state, we are ignoring Medicaid. There's $100 billion that Texas has sitting on the table for 10 years if we expand Medicaid. But no, we don't want government to come into the state, so we have 4.25 million people who are uninsured, including 625,000 children. We don't raise our gas tax since 1991 in Texas, and consequently, what happens is we bring in companies to build toll roads, and we pay a tax that way. It's a shell game, and we've got, although we have no state income tax, and they brag about that, we have bonded indebtedness that approaches like $60 billion, and they hide it. So the politicians can say, hey, I didn't raise your taxes. But my hope is that this incident has unveiled what's really going on in Texas, and people like Ted Cruz and Greg Abbott will pay a price for it, and the people in the state will realize if you want infrastructure that works, if you want roads and good schools and highways and mass transportation, you have to pay for it, just like you do everything else.
Jim, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.